Hello everyone. I'm Nureen D'Souza, Director of the Open Source Program Office at Capital One. Along with me, I have John Mark Walker, my former colleague and an enthusiastic open source leader who's now at Fannie Mae. We both are excited to be here to talk about OSPO 3.0. This talk is centered around fostering a culture of collaboration and a brief history of how open source program office has evolved over time, along with technology we depend upon to solve business problems. So the key takeaways and reason for today's talk is to share that OSPOs can provide great value to help your organization solve business problems. If you start looking at open source lifecycle holistically and collaborate with the open source project community and establish open source like culture where you inner source to create a prioritized backlog for developing products, breaking silos, and establishing automated processes to adopt, change, and transform. So with that, I will hand it off to John Mark to give his perspective and provide a brief overview of OSPO's iterative journey.
Thank you, Nureen. Yes, this is John Mark. And if I had to encapsulate the entirety of this talk, it would be culture change is hard. And as part of that, how do you drive the culture that you want to see? And how do you make sure that your open source program office is adding the value that it can? Open source program offices have had a long history. Well, not that long, I suppose, but going over 2 decades now, starting with IBM and Intel and Sun, and then maybe a little later, Google. If you look at Open Source Program Office 1.0, it was all about how do we take our engineering teams and pull in open source software to help us build product faster. And it was all about just taking it and using it. And then sometime after that, Google came in and decided that, hey, you know what? Community development is a core part of open source. And so we're going to focus on that as well. And so that went on for a couple of years. And I think for a big vendor, it was pretty valuable. But at that point, there really were no end user companies that were putting together open source program offices. But then a couple of years later, and we keep evolving and the open source universe keeps growing. And then we started realizing that, well, we need to understand what's the legal framework for using open source. As open source grew beyond the initial set of early adopters, a lot more companies that didn't have that history were trying to figure out how do they make use of open source software, and how do they use it internally, and how do they make sure that they're compliant, and that they understand the legal and the information security ramifications of using open source software. But it was still kind of early days, and that was kind of the point where things started to transition or pivot from big, large vendors to end user companies. And when you look at Open Source Program Office 2.0, that's where you see companies like Capital One start to release their open source program office, because they, like many companies, realized that, hey, we have to use open source software, and let's figure out the best way to do so. And we started to see this slow migration away from, not away from, but in addition to vendors, now the end user companies were figuring out that we also have to build applications for the cloud, and we also have to release early and release often. And what better way to do that than to have a model for using open source software? But these were still highly focused on, using the actual software, the tools, maybe some of the compliance and processes, but we hadn't really seen things move in a direction where an open source program office was taking on all of that and kind of the culture of collaboration. And to describe kind of the meat of Open Source 3.0, I'm going to turn it over to Nureen, who's going to walk through that.
Thanks, John Mark. So OSPO 3.0, what is open source culture, right? We talk about fostering culture of collaboration. What is it? So many of you may believe it if I say it is more than just reusing free code on GitHub or similar repositories to get products to market faster. In my opinion, it is an ethos that values sharing. The culture embraces an approach to software development that emphasizes internal and external contribution, an increasing focus on core competencies, and iterative implementation of policies and automated processes commonly associated with microservices and cloud native technologies. To summarize, open source program offices are instrumental to promoting a culture that makes companies more productive. If you focus more around fostering culture of collaboration. And with that, I will again pass it back on to John Mark, who can go over some challenges that you might be facing in your organization. As we all understand, culture change is hard, and there are patterns that we've recognized, and John Mark is happy to share that with you all.
Yes, I'm highly enthusiastic if I can get off of mute to share my points of view. Thank you. So yes, open source program offices have proliferated over the years, but there are all sorts of questions about where do they fit. With success comes some challenges, and we're really talking about something new that in the vast majority of companies where they're being created, there's no real shared open source history. And so there are many questions about what is the value it adds and how do you measure success, and should it be in the organization? Should it be in the CTO office? Should it be in the CIO office? Should it be in your central IT? Should it be in your marketing group? Sorry. But there are all sorts of questions about, as we're still in the formational stages of what an open source program office is, we're coming around to a more complete picture of the value that can be added and what the purpose is. And it just comes back to the culture and how culture change is hard, and how do you create the culture that you want? How do you drive that culture, and how do you bring it back to the people, process, technology framework that was so instrumental to the early DevOps principles and Agile for that matter? But what we're finding is that as we go through time, Agile and DevOps have not entirely been as successful as perhaps they could have been. And we're trying to figure out how do we add to that. And I think when you look at an open source program office and where it fits in sort of the digital transformation and modernization picture, I think the open source program office is primed to add the kind of value and to drive the culture change that you want to see to complete the circle of your digital transformation, and to really focus on the people in the people, process, and technology. And I think that's where an open source program office comes in. I think that's where InnerSource comes in. It really brings it back to the people that make up an organization and how they form a culture, and how you change culture over time. When you talk about digital transformation, and you think about the open source program office and InnerSource, we have all sorts of examples that we can point to now, where both examples in favor of InnerSource and cultural collaboration, as well as documented anti-patterns that show what happens when you don't do that, or maybe you do it in an incomplete way. But we've seen several examples now where, for example, there's an article from Sloan MIT about how leaders really need to focus on, the culture part of digital transformation, because so many times that has come up short, where the cultural change doesn't quite meet the standards that they had set. There are also examples where, even though you can provide the best process and technology and you can drive automation, that doesn't mean that it's going to be adopted as much as you want it to be. A lot of times there are pockets of resistance, in some cases, really large pockets of resistance, because again, change is hard. People are scared of change, and there's a lot of resistance to the change they need to become that sort of modern cloud first open source organization that you're trying to drive. And so the question is, how do you crack that? How do you unlock it? How do you drive the change that you want to see? And where does this come back to the open source style collaboration? Now, I've lived in open source communities for over 2 decades. So for me, open source collaboration is second nature. But in many of these companies, when they were created, a lot of times before open source became a thing, they didn't have these standards of collaboration. And so when trying to unlock that, understand that it's going to be slow. It's not going to happen overnight. it's a marathon, not a sprint. And so be patient, but I'm convinced that the Open Source Program Office is the ideal place to help drive this transformation. And then one final example I want to cite as it pertains to collaboration. The World Bank did a study of an open source project they released called GeoNode. And they want to understand what was the return on investment from pushing resources and money into this upstream open source project. And they found two things. One was you got about a 2x return on your ROI when it comes to investing in collaboration. But to me, that wasn't the most interesting part. The most interesting part was when you look at how they invested into the project, over 40% of the investment came in the form of documentation, marketing, community building, all the sort of soft skills that you don't associate with engineering, and probably less than 60% was really invested in core engineering. And so it's something useful to keep in mind when you look at what's the best way to frame the discussion when you think of the value of an open source program office, the value of inter-source collaboration. That's really the thing to key on, is how do you take that and apply it internally? Thank
you. Yep. Thank you, John Mark. So when open source program offices are built with right partners, like John Mark mentioned, to collaborate with through inner sourcing, you will see benefits in your organization, like increased awareness of open source, more speed and agility in the software development lifecycle, better compliance. But in order to reap those benefits, fostering the culture of collaboration within a source is important. And that will help your organization to drive organizational excellence by implementing a well-managed open source usage, enabling contributions, easy, automated, seamless processes for contributing to upstream open source project you depend upon. Launch new innovative projects, a defined light touch process to launch new open source projects that could solve a business problem, as you could have talented people contributing to that project that you have open sourced. Grow collaborative communities. Define engagement model is important for inner sourcing to reduce the tech debt, maintenance costs, etc. And lastly, scale foundation investment, because building the symbiotic strategic relationships with foundations and communities to increase collaboration is important, whether it's internally or externally. And overall understanding open source project communities is key, right? I mean, that's how you would be able to contribute back and be an active partner. So you all might be wondering, how do I get started, right? What is the best way to get me started? So number one, understanding your organization culture is important, because it can be in various line of, like if you look at a spectrum, right? And there's a very good article by Ron Westrom has explained the organization culture, and organizations are basically grouped in three categories, which can be on a different level of the spectrum. So on one spectrum, you have power-oriented, you might feel more controlled organization, and maybe more toxic, that may hinder your productivity, or where you might feel change is an uphill battle or bridging is discouraged. On the other hand, you have a performance-oriented organization. You will see change initiated top down from your leadership, CEOs writing books. For example, Jim Whitehurst from Red Hat wrote a book on open source. Or you have CEOs that believe in the transformation and culture change with bold missions like Capital One, changing banking for good, right? But the most organizations fall in the middle, where you see a more bureaucratic pattern, especially in the financial services, because we are in a regulated environments, and this can pose interesting challenges as well for those trying to aspire to find that hybrid model to create a high performance oriented culture to foster behaviors like high cooperation, risks are shared, bridging is encouraged, fail fast, learn and iterative. You build, you own it, right? So it is important to understand what type of organization you are versus what you want it to be. Number two, and John Mark, please feel free to add here.
Oh yeah, no, I was sorry. I was just going to add that, yeah, thank you for bringing up the challenges that come with the highly regulated environment, because there's no way that a financial institution or really any large enterprise is going to behave culturally like a startup. And so it's important to set expectations at a reasonable level and to understand, how you're actually going to be able to make progress. Sorry, that was the only point I wanted to make.
Yeah, and the second point here that I would like to make is, building a solid foundation, right? We all know our engineers need and use open source in their day-to-day work, and they're willing to follow the company's open source policy and standard. Everybody wants to do the right thing. But where they do not find the policy sensible beyond a point and hinders their productivity, you will see resistance, right? They will find a workaround. Yes, the organization may not like it and may even deem it as a risk when you don't follow the standard. But the solution is not a stricter policy. It's a policy that you want to put in place is a policy that works in practice, is easy, transparent, codified, and codified, right? And part of your development life cycle. You can establish such policy and processes if you collaborate with those who are affected in this field, like your engineers, your delivery teams, as primary stakeholders. The risk, information systems, legal departments can be secondary stakeholders. We need to accept the reality of open source software and its use and look at it as an enabler. Many organizations view open source with an overly pessimistic view rather than as a business enabler. So open source is now a reality and here to stay. So it is important you recognize different uses for open source programs and tools. So I would start with a strong core team of people who are capable of building a solid foundation and establishing policy and standard to influence the right behavior and drive compliance in a well-managed way. So open source program office plays a very important role to drive that collaboration across different subject matter expertise to solicit feedback from first line stakeholders as well as the second line stakeholders, right? Second, identify your strategic partners who are thought leaders, technology experts, supporting different line of business in your organization, who can help connect the dots across tech to enable optimal open source strategy that can work for everyone. So in my opinion, again, there are 4 key elements here where strategic partners can play a huge role partnering with open source program office, right? So demand shaping, they can help open source program office articulate the ROI and advocate for high value open source projects that you need to invest in. Value realization, review, mentor the novice developers that just join to increase code quality of the upstream contributions and fix vulnerabilities upstream, right? Servicing, be the early adopters, provide best practice insight for using open source, dev tools and framework. And lastly, exploring, right? Take a longer term view of business strategy to identify open source trends with potential to create value. So these are the 4 key elements that I can see that if you identify the right strategic partners, you can implement a framework that will help along with you to influence open source strategy. And the third one here is the developer communities who are skillful, talented engineers who understand internal and external communities and other change agents who share how to use open source software in a well-managed way. They understand risks associated with them and are able to contribute back to fix security vulnerabilities and be the change agents for us, right? So building an architecture for your community foundation is important to ensure you have the right people involved.
Thanks. This is a really great slide, Nureen. I think it really sort of brings home how open source program offices are these highly matrixed organizations that require this great depth and breadth of partnership. And when I think about where an open source program office is positioned, it really is kind of the bridge between that developer community and maybe those groups that, well, let's just be frank, don't maybe not have the greatest reputation among developer communities. But with an open source program office, you're in position to partner with these unsung heroes in your risk management and legal and information security groups, and you're able to bridge the gap between them and the developer community that you're serving. And if you're doing it right and you're driving the culture that you want to do to create, then you can create these sort of win-win scenarios where, you know, most of the people in risk and legal, they want to do the right thing. They have the same goals fundamentally as everyone else. They just want things to go in the right direction. And it's incumbent upon the open source program office to show the value that's provided to create the framework that these groups can use to partner with you and build what you're looking to create and serve the developer community in a better way. Developer communities are kind of the unsung heroes in many companies. I don't think enough is invested in creating internal developer communities. And so again, reframing this with inner source allows us to refocus on what it takes to build a developer community and why it's so important. So.
Yeah, and the last thing here, right? You know, we talked about your culture, we talked about people, and how do you empower developer community, right? That's my third takeaway here for you is, you know, you must be wondering, how do you empower engineers, right? Is there clear principles? So you can, I mean, by implementing DevSecOps principles, they are built on like, you know, right people identified or well-managed automated processes defined. Technology is paving a path for success. Shifting left decision-making, automating controls, policies are part of your development life cycle, right? Versus production pipeline. Governance, right? Measuring results and establishing comprehensive metrics, right? These are the principles where DevSecOps is built upon, right? As you shift left your security requirements, upstream contributions to fix bugs and scan for open source component supportability upfront, whether it is, you know, ensuring there is no security vulnerabilities, or there is good maintenance, or you're using the right license. You will see engineers then ingesting clean code and shifting right to build it, you own it model, increasing speed to market, right? So DevSecOps journey should not be focused on a final outcome, in my opinion, right? But rather continuous improvement and maturation of the culture within the organization, right? Ensure right metrics and KPIs are established to measure and reflect gaps for continuous improvement so that it can be enabled. Anything else, Sharmak, you want to add here?
Just that this is a really great slide. I love what you did here. But it really kind of spells out that, you know, internal processes are super important, obviously, but there's always the idea that you have to remember where this stuff comes from. And when you think about shifting left, you hear a lot of people talk about shifting left, but you have to think about shifting way left and remember, where does your ecosystem come from? What's the source of the things that you use to build so much on? Where are your dependencies, and how do you mitigate the risk in those dependencies? You don't mitigate them by shutting off, you mitigate them by being present and incorporating that into your process.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I hope this talk has been informative, and I would leave you with 6 C rules, which has helped me to remember as I implement open source program office, right? And maybe this will help you as well as you implement open source program office in your organizations, or looking to scale your existing open source office. So culture, right? So number 1 is the culture. Understand your organization culture. Number 2, collaborate, right? Identify the right strategic partners. 3, communicate, create clear guidelines on the use of open source, and make engagement opportunities visible, right? So everybody knows how to engage with open source. Number 4, compliance. Be proactive, not reactive, and measure constantly, right? That is the key to process improvements and improvements in how you do compliance in your organization. Consume. Number 5 is consume. Make it easy to use open source in a well-managed way. Like, make your framework boring, not exciting, right? So number 6 is the contribute, the last one here, but automating contribution, making it part of your engineering work to fix vulnerabilities on open source projects that you heavily depend upon is very critical, right? Because a company's values are really manifested in their policies and actions. So having policies about contributing to open source projects means that your senior management leaders have accepted that benefiting from open source projects is more than freeloading. It is about giving back and maintaining the integrity of the open source projects that you're really dependent upon. So that is my 6C role, and that's how I look at it.
Well said. There's really not much to add there, except listen to Nureen. She'll never guide you wrong. But when I look at the compliance and contribute pieces, those are two things that sometimes can go in the wrong direction, and this is where it's up to you as an open source program office to partner effectively to make sure that both of those go in the right direction, so that they're actually enabling the addition of business value and not preventing it. And that's really the key pieces that that will unlock a lot of other things, in addition to and will help you drive the culture change as part of that. But yeah, this is exciting stuff.
Oh, so again, I thank you for the opportunity. I think this is our last slide here.
Yeah.
And if there are any questions, we'll definitely take that now.
Yeah, these are this is our contact info. Feel free to reach out to us. I got to say, like, open source program offices have been in development for a couple of decades. And I really do feel like we're at the frontier of something that is helping to drive the internal change that we want to see, helping companies be more responsive, help developers feel, I guess, like they're adding more value, and then pulling people together in a way that moves in the right direction. I think, are there any questions? Hang on a second. I don't see anything at the moment. Okay, yeah. Cool.
Yeah, I really thank you for the opportunity to speak at this event, and hopefully an in-person session next time around versus virtual. Also, thank you All Things Open and All Involved for putting together such a great event. Again, I'm Nureen D'Souza, a continuous learner and passionate about solving business problems by using the right technology and framework. So if you want to connect, hit me up on LinkedIn or send me an email. Also, we are hiring if you're interested in joining an amazing company filled with talented people. So ask me about our open roles within the open source program office and other areas within Capital One. So.
Yes, ditto. Hit me up and we'll hook you up. Thank you.